I couldn't feel my legs. That's all I could think as I stared up at the cloudless July sky from my parents' backyard. "Walk it off. Stop being a baby," my father yelled, standing over me with his arms crossed. My brother Brandon stood 10 feet away, that familiar smirk playing across his face. My mother pushed through the crowd of birthday guests, her voice shrill as she accused me of being dramatic and ruining Brandon's 25th birthday. I tried to wiggle my toes, move my feet, anything. Nothing happened. Pure terror flooded through me. Sarah, our neighbor who worked as a paramedic, dropped to her knees beside me. Her hands moved quickly, professionally, checking my responses. When she saw my legs lying at odd angles, completely unresponsive to her tests, her face went pale. She grabbed her radio and called for police backup along with the ambulance. The fall replayed in my mind as Sarah stabilized my neck. Brandon had been showing off on the second-story deck, pretending to lose his balance near the railing. When I rushed over to grab him, laughing at his joke, he suddenly spun around and shoved me hard. I remembered the sensation of flying backward, the brief moment of weightlessness, then the sickening crack as my back hit the edge of the deck stairs. After that, nothing but the unforgiving ground and this terrifying numbness. Sarah wouldn't let my parents ride in the ambulance. She cited medical protocol, but I saw something else in her eyes when my father demanded to accompany me. Suspicion, maybe. Concern that went beyond standard procedure. My mother's protests faded as the ambulance doors closed, and we pulled away with sirens wailing. At County General, everything moved in a blur of harsh fluorescent lights and urgent voices. The emergency room doctor, a woman in her 50s named Dr. Carla Myers, ordered immediate scans. The CT machine hummed around me. Then I was wheeled into the MRI tube. The banging and whirring felt like it lasted hours. I kept trying to move my toes, kept praying for any sensation below my waist. Still nothing. My parents arrived as they were wheeling me back to the emergency bay. My father's face was red, his voice booming through the hallway. "This is ridiculous," he announced to anyone who would listen. "She's fine. She's always been overdramatic. We need to take her home before this gets blown out of proportion." My mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, playing the worried parent for the nurses. But her words cut deep. "You've ruined Brandon's birthday," she hissed when she got close enough that only I could hear. "He only gets one 25th birthday, and you had to make it all about you." Dr. Myers emerged from the radiologist's office, her expression grave. She asked my parents to step outside, then pulled the curtain around my bed. What she showed me on her tablet made my blood run cold. The current injury was severe. A spinal cord contusion at L1 and L2, the vertebrae in my lower back, swelling and bruising around the spinal cord itself. The damage was causing my paralysis, and Dr. Myers explained in careful, measured terms that it might be temporary or it might be permanent. They wouldn't know for weeks, maybe months. But that wasn't what made her hands shake slightly as she swiped to the next image. The MRI had also captured my entire spine. And there, clear as day at T12, was evidence of old compression fractures. The bones had healed, but improperly. The vertebra was slightly collapsed, with calcification that suggested the injury had occurred at least 2 years ago, maybe longer. "When did this happen?" Dr. Myers asked gently. "Did you ever receive treatment for a back injury?" My mind raced backward. 2 years ago, Thanksgiving. We'd been at my parents' house, and Brandon had been drinking. I'd walked past him on the stairs, carrying plates to the kitchen, and suddenly I was tumbling down, dishes shattering around me. Brandon claimed I'd tripped over his feet. My parents said I was clumsy, always had been. When I complained about back pain for weeks afterward, my mother said I was being dramatic, that I probably just pulled a muscle. My father refused to take me to the doctor, said it was a waste of money for some bruises. I'd believed them. I'd thought I was overreacting. Now, looking at the evidence on that screen, I understood. Brandon had pushed me then, too, and my parents had known. They'd seen me struggle to walk, heard me cry out in pain at night, and they'd done nothing. Dr. Meyer's face hardened as I told her. "I'm required by law to report this," she said quietly. "This is a pattern of abuse and medical neglect." Before I could process that, she explained I needed emergency surgery. The current injury was severe enough that without intervention, I might lose all function below the waist permanently. Even with surgery, my chances were maybe 50-50. They needed to operate within hours to stabilize my spine and reduce the swelling pressing on my spinal cord. A hospital social worker appeared, a tired-looking man in his 40s named Gary Thornton. He asked me questions in a low voice while nurses prepped me for surgery. Had there been other incidents? Did I feel safe at home? Had anyone ever prevented me from seeking medical care? The answers poured out of me. Years of Brandon's pranks. Years of my parents dismissing every injury, every close call, every time I said I was hurt or scared. While I was being wheeled to pre-op, I heard raised voices in the corridor. My father was shouting at Dr. Myers about patient rights and threatening lawsuits. My mother was crying loudly, making a scene about her poor injured daughter. But underlying it all, I caught fragments of their real conversation. If she talks, if she tells them things, if this becomes official, they weren't worried about me. They were worried about themselves. The last thing I heard before the anesthesia took me under was a police officer asking to speak with my parents about some concerning findings. My father's voice rose to a roar. My mother's sobs became shrieks. And as darkness claimed me, I realized my entire life had been built on their lies. I woke up in a recovery room with thick bandages wrapped around my torso and an IV drip sending cold medicine into my arm. The first thing I tried to do was wiggle my toes. Still, nothing. The numbness persisted, a void where my legs should be. Panic surged through me until a nurse appeared, adjusted my pain medication, and promised the doctor would explain everything soon. Detective Marcus Stone introduced himself that afternoon. He was a man in his early 50s with graying hair and tired eyes that had probably seen too much. He pulled a chair close to my hospital bed and spoke in a voice that was firm but surprisingly gentle. The hospital had filed a mandatory report. The paramedic had noted suspicious circumstances. Dr. Myers had documented the old injury. And now the police were involved whether my parents liked it or not. Marcus asked me to tell him everything. So I did. The memories came flooding back, incidents I'd buried or explained away for years. When I was 19, working at my family's restaurant, Brandon had locked me in the walk-in freezer for what he said was supposed to be 5 minutes as a joke. He'd gotten distracted, started drinking with his friends, and forgotten about me. 2 hours later, a dishwasher found me hypothermic and barely conscious. My parents claimed I'd wandered in by accident, and somehow the door had stuck. No police report. No hospital visit beyond the ER. Just my mother's angry lectures about being more careful. When I was 23, my car's brakes had failed on the highway. I'd barely managed to coast to a stop using the emergency brake, avoiding a massive pileup. The mechanic who towed my car told me the brake lines had been cut, clearly deliberate. When I confronted Brandon, he'd laughed it off, said the mechanic was trying to scam me. My parents paid for the repairs quietly and told me not to report it to police or insurance. They didn't want drama. At 25, Brandon pushed me into the pool at a family gathering. I'd had a severe inner ear infection and had told everyone I couldn't get my head wet. The impact ruptured my eardrum. I'd spent 3 days in the hospital with complications. My parents said I'd slipped on the wet concrete. Brandon bought me flowers and apologized. Said he didn't know about the infection even though I'd mentioned it at lunch an hour earlier. There were dozens of other incidents. Small pranks that sent me to urgent care. Broken bones explained away as accidents. Near misses with cars, with tools, with dangerous situations that Brandon somehow always created, and I somehow always ended up in the middle of. Marcus listened to it all, taking notes, his jaw getting tighter with each story. Then he showed me his phone. They'd pulled Brandon's social media accounts, found deleted videos. He'd been filming his pranks, posting them online, then deleting them after a few days. But the internet never forgets. Police forensic techs had recovered dozens of files. In one video, Brandon was explaining to his friends how he planned to mess with my car. In another, he was laughing about the freezer incident, describing my screams as hilarious. In the most damning video, dated just 3 months ago, Brandon looked straight at the camera and said, "She always forgives me, and Mom and Dad always take my side. I can do whatever I want. She's too scared to ever stand up to me or them. It's perfect." Marcus told me they'd arrested Brandon that morning for aggravated assault. The video evidence, combined with the medical records, was overwhelming. The district attorney was building a case, and it was looking serious. But then Marcus hesitated. There was more. Child Protective Services was also investigating. Even though I was 27 now, the pattern suggested possible childhood abuse. If Brandon had been doing this for years, and my parents had been covering it up, there could be criminal charges against them too. Medical neglect, endangering a dependent family member, conspiracy to obstruct justice. I should have felt relieved. Finally, someone believed me. Finally, there would be consequences. Instead, my phone started ringing. My Aunt Diane, my father's sister, called first. Her voice was ice cold. "How could you do this to your family?" she demanded. "Making up these lies about Brandon. He's a good boy. Everyone knows you're mentally unstable. You need to drop these charges right now and stop embarrassing us." Then came my Uncle Robert, my cousin Jessica, my mother's book club friends. One after another, they called to tell me I was destroying the family over nothing, that I'd always been dramatic, that I was clearly having some kind of breakdown and needed psychiatric help, not police intervention. My parents had gotten ahead of the story. They'd called everyone they knew, spinning the narrative. Rochelle had always been troubled. Rochelle was jealous of Brandon's success. Rochelle was making false accusations because she wanted attention, and people believed them. My father was a respected cardiovascular surgeon at the largest hospital in the state. My mother sat on the school board and organized charity galas. They had money, status, connections. I was just their difficult daughter who'd never quite lived up to expectations. Marcus warned me it would get worse before it got better. He was right. The hospital bills started arriving. The emergency surgery had cost $87,000. My insurance, the basic plan I could afford on my dental hygienist's salary, covered only $42,000. The remaining $45,000 was my responsibility, plus the ambulance, plus the hospital stay, plus the physical therapy I would need. The bills piled up to over $100,000. When I called my parents, thinking they might help since their son had caused this, my mother laughed, a bitter, harsh sound. "You brought this on yourself," she said. "We're not paying for your vindictive lies." Then she hung up. I lay in that hospital bed, unable to feel my legs, drowning in debt, with my entire family turned against me. The surgery had stabilized my spine, but Dr. Myers couldn't promise I'd ever walk normally again. The nerve damage was extensive. I was looking at months of intensive physical therapy, and even then, I might need a wheelchair permanently. Brandon made bail 2 days later. His lawyer, one of the most expensive criminal defense attorneys in the state, argued he was no flight risk and had strong family ties. The judge agreed. $50,000 bail, which my parents paid immediately. That night, Brandon posted on social media a photo of him at home, smiling, with a caption that read, "Innocent until proven guilty. Some people will do anything for attention. Thanks to everyone who knows the truth and stands by me." It got 300 likes within an hour. Physical therapy started on my 10th day in the hospital. A therapist named Joel Crawford, built like a former linebacker, helped me try to move from the bed to a wheelchair. The pain was indescribable. Every tiny movement sent lightning bolts of agony through my back, and my legs, those useless traitors, just hung there like dead weight. Joel was patient and encouraging, but I could see the concern in his eyes. I wasn't progressing as fast as I should. The nerve damage was worse than they'd hoped. He talked about adaptive equipment, accessibility modifications, long-term care plans, all the words people use when they don't want to say you might never walk again. Dr. Myers told me I'd be discharged in a week. Insurance wouldn't cover more inpatient time. I'd need to continue physical therapy as an outpatient, 3 times a week at a minimum, for at least 6 months. Each session cost $237, and insurance would only cover 80% after my deductible was met. I needed to figure out housing. My apartment was a 3rd-floor walk-up. No elevator, narrow stairs, completely inaccessible for someone in a wheelchair. I'd need a new place, ground floor, wide doorways, roll-in shower. Those apartments cost more than I'd been paying, and I'd need to come up with first and last month's rent plus security deposit. I called my bank to see how much I had saved. I'd been careful with money, putting away a portion of every paycheck for years. I should have had around $73,000 in my savings account. The automated system told me my balance was 0. I called back, certain it was an error, talked to a customer service representative who put me on hold, then came back sounding confused. "Ma'am, there was a withdrawal of $73,212 4 days ago. It was processed legally from a joint account holder." Joint account holder. The words made my stomach drop. The account had been opened when I was 17, with my mother listed as co-owner in case I needed help managing my money as a minor. I'd never gotten around to removing her, never thought I needed to, never imagined my own mother would steal from me. But she had. They'd taken everything I'd saved, every dollar I'd worked for, and it was completely legal because her name was on the account. I called my parents' house. My father answered. When I asked about the money, he didn't even try to deny it. "We used it for Brandon's legal defense," he said, matter-of-factly. "He needs the best representation money can buy. Your false accusations created this mess. It's only fair you help pay for it." I was too shocked to even scream. They'd stolen my life savings to defend the son who'd paralyzed me. My mother got on the phone. Her voice was cold and businesslike. "We've also cleared out your childhood bedroom," she announced. "Your things are boxed up. We left them with the hospital security. Don't bother coming back to the house. We've changed the locks." She hung up before I could respond. I was being evicted from my childhood home while paralyzed in a hospital bed by the people who were supposed to protect me. Gary, the hospital social worker, found me sobbing an hour later. He listened to the whole story, his expression darkening with each detail. Then he made some calls. He connected me with an attorney named Patricia Brennan, who specialized in disability rights and family law. Patricia took one look at my case and took it pro bono. She filed an emergency lawsuit against my parents for financial elder abuse. The law technically covered disabled adults of any age, not just the elderly. She also filed a civil suit against Brandon for damages. But Patricia warned me, these cases take months, sometimes years. Meanwhile, I needed somewhere to live immediately. The only option was a Medicaid-funded nursing facility. At 27 years old, I would be moving into a nursing home. The transition happened fast, too fast. One day I was being discharged from County General. The next I was being wheeled into Meadowbrook Care Center. The place smelled like disinfectant and sadness. Most of the residents were in their 80s and 90s. They stared at me as I rolled past, this young woman in a wheelchair who didn't belong there but had nowhere else to go. My roommate was an 84-year-old woman named Dorothy Campbell. She had advanced dementia and didn't always remember where she was. Some nights she screamed for her children who rarely visited. Other nights she cried for a husband who'd been dead for 15 years. I cried too. Alone in that shared room with its thin curtain divider and harsh overhead lights, I cried for everything I'd lost. My independence, my home, my savings, my family, my ability to walk, my future. Brandon posted another social media update. This one, a family photo from his childhood. A picture of him and me playing in a sandbox, both of us smiling. The caption read, "I love my sister and always will. praying she gets the help she needs. Mental illness is real, and we need to support those who suffer from it. He'd reframed the entire narrative. Now he was the concerned brother worried about his mentally ill sister, who was making false accusations due to her condition. It got 700 likes and hundreds of supportive comments. 3 months crawled by in that nursing home. Physical therapy 3 times a week, each session a brutal reminder of what my body couldn't do. I'd regained some sensation in my legs, could feel pressure and temperature changes, but walking was still impossible. The best I could manage was standing with a walker for maybe 30 seconds before my legs gave out. Joel kept saying I was making progress, but it didn't feel like progress. It felt like failure. Brandon's criminal trial started on a Tuesday in October. The courthouse was downtown, a 20-minute drive from Meadowbrook. Patricia arranged for medical transport to take me there and back each day. I had to testify, had to face him, had to relive everything in front of a jury. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected. Brandon sat at the defense table in an expensive suit, looking nothing like the violent person I knew him to be. His lawyer, a sharp-faced woman named Teresa Whitmore, had coached him well. He looked humble, concerned, like a man wrongly accused rather than a predator who'd spent years tormenting his sister. I wheeled myself to the witness stand and was sworn in. The prosecutor, an assistant district attorney named David Fuller, asked me to describe what happened on Brandon's birthday. I told the truth, every horrible detail. Then Teresa Whitmore stood up for cross-examination, and I understood why my parents had paid her so much. She painted me as the vindictive sister, jealous of the golden child brother. She brought up every job I'd quit, every relationship that hadn't worked out, every time I'd struggled in school. She made it sound like I'd been competing with Brandon my whole life and losing, and now I was trying to destroy him out of spite. Isn't it true, Miss Garrison, that you've been diagnosed with depression and anxiety? Yes, I admitted, because therapy isn't shameful and I wasn't going to lie. She pounced on it. And isn't it true that these conditions can affect memory and perception? Can cause someone to misinterpret innocent actions as malicious? I wanted to scream that being depressed didn't make me delusional, but David objected before I could respond. The worst part came when my parents testified for the defense. My mother took the stand wearing a conservative dress and pearls, looking like everyone's ideal of a devoted parent. She cried as she described me as a troubled child, always prone to accidents and dramatics. She claimed I'd been clumsy since birth, always falling, always hurting myself, always needing attention. My father testified in his surgeon's coat, fresh from his hospital shift. He described Brandon as a devoted brother who'd always tried to help me despite my difficulties. He showed the jury photos of Brandon's childhood achievements: academic awards, sports trophies, college acceptance letters. Look at what a good boy he is, the display seemed to say. Look at what a successful young man. He's incapable of violence. Neither of them looked at me once during their testimony. The jury seemed sympathetic to Brandon. I could see it in their faces. They saw a successful young man from a good family, not the monster I knew. They saw parents who loved their son, not enablers who'd covered up abuse for decades. The trial lasted 2 weeks. During the lunch recess on the final day, I needed to use the restroom. The courthouse had an accessible bathroom on the first floor, down a long ramp from the courtroom level. Sarah, the paramedic who'd helped me the day of the injury, had been attending the trial to show support. She walked with me, chatting about her daughter's upcoming birthday party, trying to keep my spirits up as I wheeled myself down the ramp. The bathroom was empty. Sarah waited outside while I went in. When I finished and headed back out, she was gone, called away by a phone call about an emergency at her station. She'd texted me. "So sorry. Had to run. You'll be okay getting back?" I would be fine. It was just a ramp back up to the courtroom level. I'd only gone about 10 feet when my wheelchair suddenly lurched violently. The left wheel locked up completely. The chair tipped sideways. I grabbed for the brake, but the lever came off in my hand, completely detached. Then the chair rolled backward. picking up speed down the ramp. I tried to stop it, tried to drag my feet, but I had no strength in my legs, no way to brake. The wheelchair flew down the concrete ramp, hit the turn at the bottom, and I was thrown out, tumbling down a short flight of stairs I hadn't even noticed. My shoulder hit first, a sickening pop as it dislocated. Then my head bounced off concrete. Pain exploded through my skull. The world spun and went dark at the edges. Security guards came running. Someone called 911. I was rushed to the emergency room for the second time in 3 months. A maintenance worker examined my wheelchair while I was being treated. He found that the bolts holding the left wheel assembly had been deliberately loosened. The brake cables had been cut, just enough that they'd hold for a while before failing. It was designed to look like an accident, but it was clearly sabotage. Security footage showed a man in a maintenance uniform tampering with my wheelchair 90 minutes before the incident. He'd worked quickly, professionally, knowing exactly what to do. The uniform was a fake. The maintenance staff didn't recognize him. Police traced him through facial recognition. His name was Justin Hartley, Brandon's best friend since high school. When detectives searched Justin's phone, they found encrypted messages from Brandon. Instructions on how to cause the accident. A Bitcoin payment of $5,000. Brandon had tried to have me killed. New charges were filed immediately. Attempted murder, solicitation of murder, conspiracy to commit murder. The judge revoked Brandon's bail on the spot. He was taken to county jail in handcuffs, shouting that it was all a misunderstanding, that Justin had acted alone. But I was back in the hospital with new injuries, dislocated shoulder, severe concussion, more scans to check for additional spine damage. The physical therapy progress I'd made over 3 months was erased in seconds. I was back to square one, possibly worse. My parents held a press conference outside the courthouse. They announced they still stood by Brandon, that these new charges were part of the same vendetta I'd been waging against their innocent son. My mother cried on camera. My father looked stern and dignified. They started a GoFundMe for Brandon's legal defense fund, called it Justice for Brandon, wrote a long description about their son being falsely accused by a mentally unstable sister, about needing money to fight back against a corrupt system. It raised $96,000 in 4 days. Meanwhile, I lay in a hospital bed, unable to afford the additional medical care I needed. The new injuries would cost another $30,000 minimum. Bills I had no way to pay. The attempted murder charges changed everything. The jury in the assault trial, which had seemed ready to acquit Brandon, suddenly saw him differently. The evidence of him hiring someone to hurt me while I testified against him destroyed any sympathy they might have felt. They convicted him on all counts. Aggravated assault for the original injury. Attempted murder for the wheelchair sabotage. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 10. I watched from my wheelchair as they led him away. He looked back at me once, and the mask finally slipped. The fury in his eyes was terrifying. Pure hatred, undiluted by any pretense of brotherly love. But the victory felt hollow. I was still disabled, still traumatized, still drowning in medical debt. Brandon going to prison didn't fix any of that. The sentencing investigation changed things again. As part of the pre-sentencing process, the court ordered a psychiatric evaluation of Brandon. The psychiatrist, Dr. Raymond Cole, spent hours interviewing him, reviewing his history, conducting tests. His report was damning. Brandon had severe antisocial personality disorder, complete lack of empathy, inability to feel remorse, a pattern of manipulative behavior dating back to early childhood. Dr. Cole wrote that Brandon was a danger to society and would likely reoffend if given the opportunity. The prosecutor, David Fuller, used that report to subpoena more evidence. He got a warrant for my parents' home computer and personal files. What they found was devastating. My parents had been documenting Brandon's behavior for years. They knew exactly what he was. My mother's diary entries went back to when Brandon was 7. He'd been caught torturing and killing neighborhood pets, Cats mostly, but also a dog that belonged to the family down the street. My parents had paid the neighbors to keep quiet, claimed the dog had run away. At 12, Brandon pushed another child off the jungle gym at school. The boy, a classmate named Timothy, broke both arms and suffered a skull fracture. My parents hired a lawyer, paid the family $25,000 to not press charges, and convinced the school to call it an accident. At 15, Brandon started a fire in the school chemistry lab. The building was evacuated. Thousands of dollars in damage. My father made a large donation to the school, and the incident was scrubbed from Brandon's record. He was transferred to private school instead. At 17, Brandon assaulted his girlfriend at the time, a girl named Amanda Peters. Put her in the hospital with a broken nose and cracked ribs. My parents paid her family $50,000 to recant the police report, paid for her medical bills, and threatened to destroy her father's business if she ever spoke about it again. Every incident was documented, every payoff recorded. My mother had kept meticulous records, probably to protect themselves if Brandon ever turned on them. She'd written about feeling afraid of her own son, about knowing he was dangerous, about lying awake at night wondering what he'd do next. But they'd never gotten him help, never committed him to residential treatment, even though multiple psychiatrists recommended it, never imposed real consequences. Because my father's reputation mattered more. Because my mother's social standing depended on having the perfect family. Because admitting their son was a dangerous psychopath would have destroyed the image they'd spent decades building. The district attorney filed criminal charges against both my parents. Child endangerment, applied retrospectively for their failure to protect me and other victims when Brandon was a minor. Conspiracy to obstruct justice for covering up his crimes. Financial crimes for using my stolen money to pay his legal defense. Accessory after the fact to assault. The charges were serious. My father faced up to 20 years. My mother faced 15. They were arrested at their home on a Sunday morning. The local news covered it, showing footage of them being led out in handcuffs. My father shouted about his rights. My mother covered her face and wept, their perfect image shattered on live television. The extended family finally started to believe me. Aunt Diane called, crying, apologizing for everything she'd said. Uncle Robert sent a long email about being manipulated by my parents' lies. Cousin Jessica showed up at Meadowbrook with flowers and guilt written all over her face. But their apologies didn't change my reality. I was still in a nursing home, still disabled, still financially destroyed, still traumatized by years of abuse and months of fresh trauma. The civil lawsuit against Brandon and my parents was progressing, but Patricia warned me it could take another year before we saw any money. And that was if we won. Then my parents' lawyer, a man named Gregory Walsh, made an offer. If I agreed to stop cooperating with the criminal prosecution, they would give me back my $73,000 plus $200,000 more. A total of $273,000 to make this all go away. It was enough money to change my life, pay off my medical bills, get an accessible apartment, cover physical therapy for years, start over. David Fuller called me the same day. "Don't take the settlement," he begged. "Your parents need to face justice. If you stop cooperating, their lawyers will use it to weaken the case. They might get off with probation, community service, nothing that actually matters." I was torn between desperate need and moral obligation, between survival and justice. Patricia laid out the reality. If I took the settlement, I'd be financially stable, but my parents would likely escape serious consequences. If I refused, I'd continue struggling with crushing debt, but my parents might actually go to prison for what they'd done. It was the choice between my future and doing what was right. I thought about all of Brandon's other victims, the pets he'd killed, Timothy with his broken arms, Amanda with her shattered face, all the people my parents had paid off and silenced. If I took the money and let my parents walk away, what message did that send? That abuse was fine as long as you had money to cover it up. That protecting your reputation mattered more than protecting children. That justice was only for people who could afford to wait for it. I called Patricia back and told her my decision. no settlement. I would testify against my parents, no matter what it cost me. My decision to reject the settlement made my parents desperate. Their trial was scheduled to begin in 6 weeks. David Fuller was building a strong case, but my testimony would be the key to conviction. Without me, they had a chance at acquittal. Their new strategy was vicious. Gregory Walsh filed an emergency petition, claiming I had diminished mental capacity. The petition argued that my brain injury from the wheelchair incident, combined with severe PTSD from the trauma, had left me unable to make rational decisions or reliably testify. They wanted to have me declared legally incompetent. If successful, they wanted to be appointed my legal guardians and conservators. Think about that. The people who'd enabled my abuser, who'd stolen my money, who'd covered up years of violence, wanted legal control over my life. As my guardians, they could make all my medical decisions, control my finances, decide where I lived. They could have me institutionalized in a psychiatric facility if they wanted. And most importantly, they could prevent me from testifying. Gregory hired a psychiatrist named Dr. Howard Marsh to evaluate me. Dr. Marsh spent 2 hours at Meadowbrook, asking questions, watching me struggle through physical therapy, noting every tear, every moment of frustration, every sign of the depression and PTSD I was fighting. His report claimed I had delusional disorder, that I was unable to distinguish between reality and persecution fantasies, that I exhibited signs of severe cognitive impairment from my head injury, that I needed intensive psychiatric care and couldn't be trusted to make decisions about my own welfare. It was all lies, but it was written by a doctor with credentials and experience testifying in court. Patricia fought back immediately. She hired an independent psychiatrist, Dr. Linda Vasquez, to evaluate me. Dr. Vasquez was thorough and kind. She spent 4 sessions with me, reviewing my medical records, talking to my therapists, assessing my mental state properly. Her report was clear. I had PTSD and depression, yes, but I was fully competent. My cognitive function was normal. I understood the legal proceedings and could reliably testify. The claims of delusional disorder were baseless and appeared to be a deliberate attempt to silence an abuse victim. The competency hearing was scheduled for a Monday morning. I barely slept the night before. Dorothy had one of her bad nights, screaming for her children, and I couldn't comfort her because I was drowning in my own fear. If my parents won this hearing, everything was over. They'd control my life. They'd prevent me from testifying. They'd probably institutionalize me somewhere. I couldn't cause them any more problems, and they'd get away with everything. Sunday night, after the nurses had made their final rounds and the nursing home settled into uneasy quiet, I had a breakdown. I sat in my wheelchair in the dark, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of everything crushing down on me. I'd lost everything trying to do the right thing. My home, my independence, my health, my family, my future. And now, I might lose even the freedom to make my own choices. What was the point? Why was I fighting so hard when it just kept getting worse? Dorothy spoke up from her bed, her voice suddenly clear and lucid in a way it rarely was. "Don't give up, honey." I turned, surprised. Dorothy was sitting up, looking at me with eyes that were focused and aware. She told me about her own life, about an abusive husband who'd controlled her for 50 years, about children who took his side because he had money and status, about finally leaving when she was 65. But by then, it was too late to rebuild. She'd spent the last 20 years regretting that she hadn't fought back sooner. "I let them win," she said quietly. "I gave up fighting because it was too hard and I was too tired. I've spent half my life regretting that choice." Her eyes locked on mine. "Don't be like me. Don't let them take your voice. Fight them with everything you have, even if it costs you everything, because living with their control is worse than dying free." Then her moment of clarity faded, and she lay back down, murmuring about her children again. But her words stayed with me. The competency hearing was brutal. Gregory presented Dr. Marsh's report, showing videos of me crying during physical therapy, struggling to answer questions, appearing confused and emotional. He argued that I was clearly not in a state to make major legal decisions. Patricia presented Dr. Vasquez's report and put her on the stand. Dr. Vasquez methodically destroyed every claim Dr. Vasquez Marsh had made, pointing out that emotional responses to trauma weren't signs of incompetence, that PTSD didn't equal cognitive impairment, that I'd been fully coherent and rational in every interaction. Then Patricia called me to testify. I wheeled myself to the witness stand and told my story. Not just the recent events, but everything. Every incident of abuse, every cover-up. Every time my parents had chosen to protect Brandon instead of me or his other victims. I talked about the pattern of violence they'd enabled for decades, about the money they'd stolen, about their current attempt to silence me. I looked directly at my parents as I spoke. My father wouldn't meet my eyes. My mother stared at me with cold hatred. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Helen Thornton, reviewed all the evidence. Then she spoke. "This petition is denied." Her voice was sharp, angry. "This court finds that the petitioners have presented no credible evidence of incompetence. Furthermore, this appears to be a transparent attempt at witness intimidation and obstruction of justice. Miss Garrison is fully competent to make her own medical and legal decisions. She will be permitted to testify in the upcoming criminal trial." Then, Judge Thornton did something unexpected. She looked at the prosecutor's table where David Fuller Saturday. Given the clear pattern of intimidation and the serious flight risk these defendants now present, I'm also revoking bail pending trial. My parents were taken into custody immediately. Gregory tried to negotiate a settlement again on the courthouse steps. Patricia shut him down. The criminal trial was going forward. My parents would face a jury, and I would testify. But as I wheeled myself out of the courthouse, the victory felt Pyrrhic. I was still disabled, still living in a nursing home, still broken in ways that might never heal. I'd stood up for justice, but the cost had been devastating. I'd sacrificed everything, and I still didn't know if it would be enough. That evening, my phone rang with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, expecting another cruel call from a family member or another bill collector. Instead, it was a woman named Catherine Mills, a producer for a national news program. She'd been following my case. She wanted to do a story about family abuse, systemic failures, and medical neglect. She wanted to interview me. I was too tired to care about publicity, too broken to think about media attention. But Catherine said something that made me pause. "Your story could help other people," she said. "Other abuse victims who think they're alone. Other people whose families have silenced them. You're fighting back, and people need to see that it's possible." I thought about Dorothy's words, about all the victims my family had silenced over the years, about how my silence had protected them for so long. I agreed to the interview. Catherine's team came to Meadowbrook 2 days later. They set up cameras in the common room, asked permission from the facility, made everything official. The interview lasted 3 hours. I told everything. The lifetime of abuse, the cover-ups, the current attempts to silence me. I showed them my medical records, the MRI images, the evidence of old injuries. I talked about living in a nursing home at 27, about the crushing debt, about parents who stole from me to defend the son who'd paralyzed me. The story aired 2 weeks later on primetime national news. It was titled "The Golden Child: When Families Choose Image Over Safety." The response was immediate and overwhelming. My story went viral. Millions of people watched it online. Social media exploded with outrage at my parents and support for me. Survivors of family abuse shared their own stories, creating a wave of awareness about how often these situations are covered up. Within 48 hours, someone started a GoFundMe for my medical expenses and housing. The goal was set at $100,000. It reached that in 6 hours. By the end of the first week, strangers had donated $1.2 million. People from across the country, many of them abuse survivors themselves, wanted to help. They sent messages of support, shared their own stories, told me I'd given them courage to speak up about their own families. The money changed everything. I could pay off all my medical bills. I could afford an accessible apartment. I could cover years of physical therapy. For the first time in months, I wasn't drowning in debt. But something even more unexpected happened. A spinal surgeon named Dr. Alan Foster saw the news story. He was a specialist in nerve regeneration therapy, an experimental treatment that used electrical stimulation and targeted physical therapy to help restore function in damaged spinal cords. The treatment was cutting edge, not covered by insurance, and cost around $300,000 for the full protocol. Dr. Foster called me directly. He wanted to offer the treatment free of charge. He'd been moved by my story and wanted to see if he could help. I started the treatment in January, 6 months after Brandon had pushed me. The protocol was intense. Daily electrical stimulation sessions, hours of specialized physical therapy, exercises that pushed my body to its absolute limits. It was excruciating. There were days I wanted to quit. But slowly, impossibly, I started to improve. First, I could stand with the walker for 2 minutes, then 5, then 10. I took my first steps in February, just shuffling movements with Dr. Foster holding me steady. In March, I walked 20 feet with a walker. In April, I walked 100 feet with just a cane. I would never be the same as before. I walked with a permanent limp. I had chronic pain that would probably last the rest of my life. I tired easily. I couldn't run or do many physical activities I'd once enjoyed. But I could walk. I could live independently. I could reclaim pieces of my life. My parents' trial happened in May. I testified for 2 full days, telling the jury everything. The prosecutor presented the documentation from their home, the proof of decades of cover-ups. Former victims testified about being paid off and threatened. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury convicted them on all charges. My mother was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. My father was sentenced to 12, with his medical license permanently revoked. I watched them led away in handcuffs for the last time. I felt no satisfaction, no triumph, just a hollow ache where my family used to be. The civil lawsuit settled shortly after. My parents were ordered to pay me $3.7 million, which would come from the sale of their house, their retirement accounts, their assets. Everything they'd built would be liquidated to compensate me for what they'd done. Between the GoFundMe donations and the settlement, I had financial security for the rest of my life. Money couldn't fix everything, couldn't undo the damage, but it meant I'd never have to worry about bills again. I used some of the money to move into a beautiful, accessible apartment with wide doorways, a roll-in shower, and a view of the park. I enrolled in continuing education classes to update my dental hygienist certification, adapting my skills to work with my physical limitations. But the most important thing I did was start a nonprofit organization. I called it the Survivor's Voice Project. It was designed to help abuse victims whose families were silencing them. We connected people with attorneys who'd take cases pro bono. We provided emergency housing funds. We documented abuse, helped people get medical care they'd been denied, supported them through criminal and civil proceedings. In the first year, we helped 300 people escape abusive situations and get justice. I became an advocate, speaking at conferences about family abuse and systemic failures in reporting. I worked with lawmakers to strengthen mandatory reporting laws and close loopholes that let wealthy families pay off victims. I shared my story over and over, hoping it would help someone else find the courage to speak up. Some of my extended family reached out to apologize and rebuild relationships. I was selective about who I let back into my life. Trust, once destroyed so thoroughly, was hard to rebuild. But I found new family in unexpected places. The community of survivors I'd connected with through my nonprofit, Dr. Foster and his staff who'd helped me walk again. Patricia, who'd fought for me when I had nothing. And Joel, my physical therapist from those early dark days. We'd stayed in touch through my recovery. He'd supported me through the trials, celebrated every milestone. Somewhere along the way, friendship had turned into something more. We started dating in the fall, taking things slow, building something healthy and real. 1 year after my injury, I walked without a cane for the first time at a charity event for the Survivor's Voice Project. It was only 50 feet, and I was exhausted afterward, but I did it. The local news covered the event. I gave a speech about survival and justice and finding purpose in pain. A week later, I received a letter forwarded through my nonprofit. It was from a woman named Angela, a mother of 3 who'd been abused by her in-laws for years. She'd seen my story, found the courage to document what was happening, reported them to authorities. Her abusers were now facing charges, and she and her children were safe. "You saved my life," she wrote. "I thought I was crazy, that no one would believe me. Your story showed me it was possible to fight back and win. Thank you for being brave enough to speak up." I read that letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face. All the pain, all the loss, all the horrible things I'd endured, they'd led to this. I'd transformed my worst nightmare into something that helped others. My suffering had meaning because I'd refused to be silenced. I still had hard days. Days when the chronic pain was overwhelming. Days when the PTSD made leaving my apartment feel impossible. Days when I mourned the person I'd been before that July afternoon. But I also had good days. Days when I helped someone escape an abusive situation. Days when I walked a little farther than before. Days when I looked at the life I'd rebuilt and felt proud of my strength. My parents had tried to destroy me to protect their image. Brandon had tried to break me because he enjoyed cruelty. They'd both failed. I survived. More than that, I'd turned my survival into something powerful. Justice had taken everything from me before it gave anything back. The cost had been devastating. I'd lost my family, my health, my savings, my independence, everything I'd thought mattered. But I'd gained something more valuable. I'd found my voice. I'd discovered a strength I never knew I had. I'd learned that sometimes the right choice is the hardest one, and that fighting for justice matters even when it costs you everything. I'd learned that family isn't about blood. It's about who stands beside you when everything falls apart. It's about who believes you when everyone else calls you a liar. It's about who fights for you when you're too broken to fight for yourself. And I'd learned that we can transform our deepest pain into purpose. That our worst experiences don't have to define us. That survival isn't just about living through trauma. It's about deciding what we do with that survival afterward. My name is Rochelle Garrison. I was paralyzed by my brother while my parents watched and called me dramatic. I lost everything fighting for justice. And I won. Not because I walked again, though that was a gift. Not because I got money, though that provided security. Not even because my abusers went to prison, though that mattered. I won because I refused to be silenced. Because I turned my story into something that helps others. Because I survived, and chose to make that survival mean something. The MRI revealed more than just my injuries. It revealed the truth. And the truth, no matter how painful, is always worth fighting for. Now I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt pressured to stay silent about abuse or mistreatment because speaking up would damage family relationships or your reputation? Have you ever witnessed someone being harmed but felt powerless to help? What would you do if you were in my situation, facing the choice between financial security and holding abusers accountable? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to this channel. Sharing stories like mine helps break the silence around family abuse and gives other survivors hope. Hit that share button and send this to someone who might need to hear that they're not alone, that speaking up is possible, that justice is worth fighting for. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for believing survivors. Thank you for being part of a community that refuses to accept abuse as normal. I hope you find the courage to speak your truth, whatever that looks like for you. I hope you surround yourself with people who believe you and support you. And I hope you remember that surviving isn't enough. We survive so we can help others do the same. Take care of yourselves. Stand up for what's right. And never let anyone silence your voice.